Feared across cities and whispered about in private rooms, the Mafia boss is a man whose dominance extends beyond crime into every corner of his life, including intimacy. His reputation follows him into the bedroom, where desire quickly turns into disappointment. Women drawn by his power and wealth are overwhelmed by his relentless stamina and imposing physicality, mistaking excess for satisfaction. One by one, they retreat, some frightened, some injured in pride, all unable to meet him on equal ground. What begins as pleasure always ends in distance, leaving the boss increasingly isolated by the very traits that define him. Everything changes the night he meets a black woman who does not flinch, rush, or romanticize him. Where others scream and flee, she stays, not impressed, not intimidated, and not eager to worship his legend. She challenges him with calm confidence, setting boundaries and exposing the truth he has long avoided, that intimacy is not about endurance or size, but connection, control, and mutual understanding. For the first time, the Mafia boss must confront a woman who cannot be conquered by reputation alone, and in doing so, he faces the most difficult battle of his life, learning how to be truly satisfied. What's up, my beautiful YouTube family? Before we dive into today's intense story, do me a quick favor, hit that like button, drop a comment, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our powerful romance stories. Your support keeps these stories coming, and trust me, this one is different. Tonight's story is about desire, pride, endurance, and the one woman who refused to be impressed. Sit back, relax, and let's get into it. The bedroom door slammed at 2:47 a.m., and Minjun heard the hurried click of heels retreating down the marble hallway of his penthouse. He didn't bother calling after her. They never stayed. He sat on the edge of his bed, still catching his breath, staring at the rumpled sheets where another woman had just been. Beautiful. Eager. Gone. The pattern had become so familiar it barely registered anymore. She lasted longer than most. Almost 40 minutes before the stammered excuses began, the wide-eyed panic, the sudden need to be anywhere else. Minjun stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Seoul's glittering skyline. At 34, he controlled half the underground networks in 3 cities, commanded respect with a glance, and could have almost anything he wanted. Almost. His phone buzzed. A text from Daejeong, his second-in-command. She left crying. Security wants to know if there's a problem. Minjun typed back, no problem. Just the usual. The usual. Women came to him for the power, the danger, the wealth. They saw the tailored suits, the penthouse, the cars, the armed men who jumped at his command. They imagined the Mafia boss would translate that dominance into the bedroom, and they weren't wrong. But what they imagined and what they could handle were 2 different things entirely. He'd stopped apologizing for it years ago. His body was what it was, imposing in every sense. Combined with stamina built from discipline and a need to maintain control in all situations, he became too much. Always too much. Women who arrived with bold promises left with shaken nerves. Some claimed injury. Others just ran. A few had tried to stay but couldn't hide the fear in their eyes, and that was somehow worse than the leaving. Minjun poured himself a whiskey and stood by the window until sunrise. He had meetings starting at 9. A shipment to oversee. Territory disputes to settle. The business of being who he was never stopped, and that was fine. That, at least, he was good at. 3 weeks later, Minjun found himself in an upscale lounge in Itaewon, the kind of place where foreigners and locals mixed freely, where languages blended into a comfortable hum of expensive cocktails and low jazz. He rarely came to places like this, too public, too unpredictable, but one of his business partners insisted on meeting here. Something about neutral ground. He arrived with 2 guards who took positions near the entrance while he settled into a private booth in the back. His partner was late. Minjun ordered a drink and waited, his eyes scanning the room with practiced efficiency. That's when he saw her. She sat alone at the bar, nursing what looked like whiskey neat. Black woman, late 20s maybe, with natural hair pulled into a low puff, warm brown skin that caught the amber light, and a calm self-possession that immediately set her apart from everyone else in the room. She wasn't performing, wasn't looking around for attention or company, just existing comfortably in her own space. Minjun watched as a man approached her, young, cocky, probably thought he was charming. She listened to his opening line with polite disinterest, said something brief, and turned back to her drink. The man persisted. She set her glass down carefully, looked at him directly, and spoke again. Whatever she said made him back away with his hands up in surrender. Something about the economy of it impressed Minjun. No drama. No performance. Just clear communication and firm boundaries. His business partner arrived then, pulling his attention away. The meeting took 30 minutes, negotiations about distribution routes, percentages, the usual posturing. Minjun agreed to terms he'd already decided on before arriving and stood to leave. The woman was still at the bar. Minjun found himself walking toward her before he'd consciously decided to do so. His guards shifted, alert but not interfering. They knew better. He stopped a respectful distance away. You handled that guy well. She glanced at him, took a slow sip of her whiskey, and turned back to face the bar. Did I ask for commentary? Her accent was American, her tone flat and unimpressed. Minjun felt something unfamiliar flicker in his chest, not irritation exactly, but something adjacent to it. People didn't dismiss him. Not even subtly. You didn't, he acknowledged. I'm Minjun. Good for you. He almost smiled. You're not from here. Observant. She still hadn't looked at him fully. You run the place or something? You've got that energy. What energy? The kind that expects people to care that you walked up to them. Now he did smile. Most people do. I'm not most people. She finally turned to face him properly, her dark eyes assessing him with a directness that was almost clinical. Let me guess, you're used to getting what you want. Women probably throw themselves at you. You thought you'd try the one sitting alone because she looked like a challenge. Minjun leaned against the bar, genuinely curious now. Am I that transparent? Men like you always are. She finished her whiskey and signaled the bartender for another. The answer's no, by the way. I didn't ask a question. You were going to. The bartender poured her refill, glanced nervously at Minjun, and hurried away. She noticed. Her eyebrow raised slightly. They're scared of you, she observed. Yes. Why? It's a long story. I'm not that interested. But she hadn't left. Hadn't turned away completely. You have a name you actually use, or is Minjun supposed to impress me? Just Minjun. What's yours? She considered this for a long moment, as if deciding whether he deserved the information. Naomi. Naomi, he repeated, liking the way it sounded. What brings you to Seoul? Work. Teaching English. Same story as half the foreign women here. She studied him over the rim of her glass. What brings you to Itaewon? Seems a little mainstream for someone who makes bartenders nervous. Business meeting. Right. Business. Her tone suggested she knew exactly what kind of business. And now you're trying to unwind with a strange woman at a bar. I wasn't trying to unwind. I was curious. About what? About someone who doesn't immediately react to me. Naomi laughed, a short, genuine sound that surprised him. So you're used to reactions. Let me guess what kind. She set her glass down and turned to face him fully, her expression shifting into something more analytical. Women see you and see power. Danger. Maybe money. They want a piece of it. They come to you thinking they can handle whatever you are. Then reality hits and they can't. She tilted her head. Am I close? Minjun felt his jaw tighten. You seem to have formed a complete opinion without knowing me. I don't need to know you. I've seen men like you before. Different context, maybe, but same energy. You're used to being too much. Used to people not being able to meet you where you are. So you either get worshipped or you get abandoned, and neither one actually satisfies you. The accuracy of it landed like a physical blow. Minjun straightened, his expression cooling. You think you have me figured out. I think you came over here hoping I'd be different, and I am, just not in the way you wanted. Naomi stood, leaving cash on the bar. Enjoy your evening, Minjun. She walked away without looking back, her posture relaxed and unhurried. Minjun stood there, genuinely stunned for the first time in recent memory. His guards appeared at his side. "Boss?" Dae-young asked quietly. "I'm fine," Minjun said, still watching the door where Naomi had disappeared. "Find out where she teaches." Dae-young hesitated. "Sir, are you sure that's?" "Find out." 2 days later, Minjun had an address. Naomi-chan taught at a private language academy in Gangnam, morning and evening classes, mostly business English for corporate clients. She'd been in Seoul for 8 months. No family in Korea. No boyfriend on record. She lived alone in a modest apartment in Hongdae. Minjun told himself he was just curious, that the encounter had been unusual enough to warrant follow-up. He didn't examine why he'd thought about her conversation with him at least a dozen times since that night, or why her assessment of him had settled under his skin like a splinter. He showed up at her academy on a Thursday evening, waiting outside until her class ended. When she emerged, she saw him immediately and stopped on the sidewalk, her expression shifting from surprise to exasperation. "You've got to be kidding me," she said, walking up to him. "Did you seriously track down where I work? I wanted to talk to you. So you stalked me?" She crossed her arms. "That's not charming. That's concerning." "I'm not trying to be charming." "Then what are you trying to be?" Minjun realized he didn't have a good answer. What was he trying to be? What did he want from this woman who dismissed him so thoroughly? He settled on honesty. "I don't know," he admitted. "You said something that stayed with me." "I said several things." "You'll have to be more specific." "That I'm used to being too much. That people either worship me or abandon me." He met her eyes. "You were right." Naomi's expression softened slightly, though her guard remained up. "And you came here looking for what? Validation? Someone to prove you wrong." "No. I came because you didn't seem interested in proving anything. You just saw something and said it. And that's rare for you." "Yes." She studied him for a long moment, people flowing around them on the busy street. Finally, she sighed. "There's a coffee shop around the corner. You can buy me a cup and we can talk like normal people. But if you pull any Mafia boss nonsense, I'm leaving." "Clear." "Mafia boss?" Minjun asked carefully. "Please. I'm not stupid." "The guards, the fear, the way you carry yourself. I've been in Seoul long enough to recognize the signs." She started walking. "Coming or not?" Minjun followed. The coffee shop was small and cramped, nothing like the upscale places Minjun usually frequented. Naomi ordered an Americano and found a table in the back corner. Minjun ordered the same and sat across from her, very aware that his guards had taken positions outside, visible through the window. "So," Naomi said, wrapping her hands around her cup. "What do you actually want to talk about?" "You," Minjun said simply. "I want to know why you're different." "I'm not different. I'm just not impressed by the things that usually impress people." She took a sip of her coffee. "Power doesn't do much for me. Neither does danger or money. I grew up around both in Detroit. Saw what that life does to people. So when I see a man who carries that weight, I don't see someone to aspire to be with. I see someone who's probably lonely as hell and doesn't know how to fix it." The bluntness should have offended him. Instead, Minjun found himself leaning forward. "And you think you could fix it?" "No. And I wouldn't want to try. People don't fix people. That's codependent nonsense." She met his gaze steadily. "But I do think you're asking the wrong questions." "What questions should I be asking?" "Maybe start with why you're so uncomfortable with intimacy that you've turned it into a performance where everyone loses." Minjun felt his defenses rise. "You don't know anything about my intimate life. I know you came to a bar looking for connection and settled on me because I didn't immediately fall over myself to give you attention. I know you tracked me down even though I made it clear I wasn't interested. And I know," she paused, her expression turning more gentle, "that you're sitting here right now looking more vulnerable than you probably have in years, because someone finally called you on your patterns." He wanted to argue. Wanted to tell her she was wrong, that she didn't understand, that his situation was unique. But the words wouldn't come because she wasn't wrong. She'd identified exactly what he'd been avoiding acknowledging for years. "So what do I do about it?" he asked finally, his voice quieter than he intended. "You start by stopping. Stop performing. Stop trying to overwhelm people. Stop using your body and your stamina and your reputation as substitutes for actual connection. She leaned back. And you probably need to talk to someone who actually knows what they're doing. I'm not a therapist. But you're willing to tell me these things. Because you asked. And because she hesitated, I don't know. Maybe because you seem like you might actually be capable of hearing it. Most men in your position wouldn't be. They sat in silence for a moment, the coffee shop's ambient noise filling the space between them. Minjun felt something shifting inside him, a recognition that this conversation mattered in ways he couldn't fully articulate yet. Can I see you again? He asked. Naomi raised an eyebrow. Why? Because I think you might be the first person in years who's been honest with me without wanting something in return. I don't date criminals. I'm not asking for a date. I'm asking to see you again. To talk. Like this. She considered this carefully, her fingers drumming against her coffee cup. One condition. Name it. You don't send people to follow me. You don't investigate my life. If you want to know something, you ask me directly. And if I say no to something, you respect it. Immediately. Without argument. Agreed. I mean it, Minjun. The second you cross a boundary, I disappear. I don't care how much power you have or who you know. I'll ghost you so completely you'll think I never existed. The threat should have amused him. Instead, he found it reassuring proof that she meant what she said, that her boundaries were real and non-negotiable. I understand, he said. I'll respect your terms. Naomi nodded slowly. Okay then. We can meet again. Public places only. And you leave the guards somewhere I can't see them. I'm not having a conversation with an audience. Fair enough. They finished their coffee and exchanged phone numbers. When they parted ways outside the shop, Minjun felt something he hadn't experienced in longer than he could remember, anticipation mixed with uncertainty. He didn't know what would happen next. Didn't know if Naomi would actually respond to his messages, or if she'd decide he wasn't worth the complexity. For the first time in years, someone else held the power in his interactions, and he found he didn't mind nearly as much as he thought he would. That night, lying in his bed alone, Minjun stared at the ceiling and thought about everything Naomi had said. She'd seen through him with an ease that should have been uncomfortable, but instead felt almost relieving. Like someone had finally named something he'd been carrying silently for too long. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Did you know that vulnerability requires more courage than dominance? Just something to think about. N. Minjun read the message 3 times before responding. I'm beginning to understand that. Her reply came a few minutes later. Good. Then maybe there's hope for you yet. He smiled in the darkness of his bedroom, alone but somehow less lonely than he'd felt in months. Whatever was beginning here, friendship, connection, something else entirely, it was different. And different, Minjun was beginning to realize, might be exactly what he needed. They began meeting once a week, always in public places Naomi chose. Coffee shops in Hongdae. A bookstore in Insadong. A quiet park near the Han River. Minjun learned to arrive without his usual security detail, or at least to keep them far enough away that Naomi wouldn't notice. He learned to dress down jeans and simple shirts instead of his tailored suits. He learned to listen more than he spoke. Naomi told him about growing up in Detroit, about a father who'd been involved in things he shouldn't have been, about watching her mother wait up nights not knowing if he'd come home. She told him about leaving for college and never looking back, about teaching in 3 different countries before landing in Seoul. She spoke about her life with a matter-of-factness that suggested she'd made peace with her past without romanticizing or resenting it. Is that why you're not interested? Minjun asked during their 4th meeting as they walked along the river. Because of your father? Partially, Naomi admitted. I learned young that men who live that life rarely have room for anything else. The power becomes everything. The violence, the control, the constant need to maintain your position, it consumes you. I watched it consume my dad until there wasn't much left of the man my mom fell in love with. Did he get out? He died when I was 15. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong people who wanted his territory. She kept her eyes on the water. My mom always said he chose that life over us. Every single day he chose it, even knowing what it might cost. Minjun felt the weight of her words settle heavily. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Just be honest with yourself about what you are and what you're willing to change. She glanced at him. Are you willing to change? I don't know if I can, he said quietly. This is all I've known since I was 17. My family was already in it. I inherited more than I chose. Inherited or not, you're still choosing it every day now. You're 34. You have options. Do I? You have money. You have intelligence. You could walk away, Minjun. Start something legitimate. It wouldn't be easy, and it would take time, but you could do it. She stopped walking and turned to face him. The question is whether you want to. He didn't have an answer for her. The organization was all he knew. It was his identity, his purpose, his entire social structure. Walking away would mean losing everything except the money, and money alone had already proven insufficient. But the alternative, continuing as he was, adding more years to a life that left him increasingly isolated, felt equally impossible. I don't know what I want, he finally admitted. Then figure it out, Naomi said, not unkindly. Because I meant what I said. I don't date criminals. If you want this, she gestured between them, whatever this is becoming, to be more than whatever it is now, you'd have to want something different for yourself. And if I can't? Then we're just two people who talk sometimes. Nothing more. The boundary was clear. Minjun appreciated that even as it frustrated him. Over the past month, something had shifted in how he saw Naomi. She'd gone from an interesting anomaly to someone whose opinion mattered, whose presence he craved, whose absence created a noticeable void in his weeks. He looked forward to their meetings with an intensity that surprised him. He thought about their conversations when he should have been focused on business. He found himself measuring his decisions against an imagined version of her judgment. This was dangerous. He knew it intellectually. Caring about someone made you vulnerable. In his world, vulnerability was often fatal. And yet he couldn't seem to stop himself from wanting more of whatever this connection was. Their meetings continued through spring into early summer. Naomi remained consistent, present but boundaried, honest but not cruel, interested but not invested in changing him. She asked about his life without judgment but didn't shy away from naming things clearly. She pointed out when he was being defensive, when he was deflecting, when he was hiding behind his reputation instead of being genuine. You do this thing, she said one evening as they sat in a nearly empty cafe after her classes ended. When I get too close to something real, you shift. Your whole demeanor changes. You become the boss instead of Minjun. I don't know the difference anymore. Yes, you do. You just don't like how it feels to not be in control. He couldn't argue with that. Control was safety. Control was survival. Letting it go, even in conversation, felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. What would it look like if I did let go? He asked. I don't know. That's kind of the point. You'd have to discover it. She stirred her coffee absently. Can I ask you something personal? Yes. The women who leave, what actually happens? Like, specifically? Minjun felt his shoulders tense. This was territory they hadn't touched directly, though it hovered around the edges of many of their conversations. Why do you want to know? Because I think it's connected to everything else. The control, the isolation, the way you approach connection. I think whatever happens in those moments tells me something important about what you're actually dealing with. He was quiet for a long time, debating whether to answer honestly. The truth was humiliating. The truth revealed a vulnerability he'd spent years trying to armor against. But Naomi waited without pushing, and something about her patience made him want to try. I'm physically overwhelming, he said finally, his voice low. In every way. Size, stamina, intensity. Women come to me expecting one thing and encounter another. They think they want the power and control I have in other areas of my life translated to the bedroom. But the reality is, too much, Naomi finished quietly. Yes, some get hurt. Not intentionally, but because they're not honest about their limits or they think they can handle more than they can. Others panic. A few have tried to stay, but I can see the fear in their eyes, and that's worse somehow. They're there but not really there, just enduring, and he stopped, surprised by the emotion catching in his throat. I can't do that. I can't be with someone who's afraid of me. But you're afraid too, Naomi said. Afraid that this is just who you are and nothing will ever change. Yes. Have you ever tried? Like, actually tried to approach intimacy differently. I don't know how. This is all I know. I learned early that sex was about dominance and control. That's what the women wanted, or at least what they said they wanted. So that's what I became. Naomi was quiet, her expression thoughtful. When she spoke again, her voice was gentle. Sex isn't about dominance. Real intimacy isn't about control. It's about trust and presence and actually being with someone instead of performing for them. Everything you're describing, the stamina, the intensity, the physical overwhelm, that's all performance. It's the same pattern you have everywhere else. You're trying to prove something instead of just being. I don't know how to just be. I know. That's the problem. They sat in silence, the cafe emptying around them as closing time approached. Minjun felt exposed in a way he'd never allowed himself to be, even with her. But he also felt something else, a strange kind of relief. Like naming the problem made it real, and making it real meant it could potentially be addressed. "Would you help me?" he asked, the words coming out before he could think better of them. Naomi's eyes widened slightly. "Help you how?" "Learn. Figure out what being actually means instead of performing." "Minjun, I'm not a therapist. And I'm definitely not going to." "I'm not asking you to sleep with me," he interrupted quickly. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to help me understand what healthy intimacy looks like. Teach me what you know. Show me what I'm missing." "Why me?" "Because you're the only person who's ever been honest with me about this. Because you don't want anything from me except honesty in return. Because I trust you." The admission surprised him, but it was true. He did trust her in ways he'd never trusted anyone. Naomi looked away, clearly torn. "This is a lot to ask." "I know. And I still don't date criminals." "I know that too. So what exactly are you proposing?" Minjun took a breath. "I'm proposing that I start figuring out what I want. That I begin trying to separate who I am from what I do. That I work on understanding myself better, with your help if you're willing to give it. And in the meantime, we keep doing this, talking, meeting, being honest with each other. And if you can't change? If the life you've built is too strong to walk away from, then you were right. We're just two people who talk sometimes. Nothing more." Naomi studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face for something he hoped she'd find. Finally, she nodded slowly. "Okay, but we do this my way at my pace, with my boundaries. The second it becomes something I'm uncomfortable with, we stop. No arguments, no negotiation." "Agreed. And you have to actually do the work. I'm not going to fix you or save you or any of that bullshit. If you want to change, you have to want it for yourself, not for me." "I understand." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, the first time she'd initiated physical contact. The touch was warm and firm and absolutely non-sexual, but Minjun felt it like electricity. "Okay then," she said. "Let's start with something simple. Tell me about the first time you realized intimacy was a problem for you." Over the next hour, as the cafe staff cleaned around them and eventually asked them politely to leave, Minjun talked. He told her about being 19 and sleeping with a woman who'd seemed eager until she wasn't, who'd left his bed crying and confused. He told her about the pattern repeating through his 20s, about trying to moderate himself and failing, about the growing isolation as he realized he couldn't connect with people the way he wanted to. Naomi listened without judgment, asking clarifying questions, pointing out patterns he hadn't noticed. When they finally left the cafe and stood on the street corner saying goodbye, Minjun felt lighter than he had in years. "Same time next week?" he asked. "Same time," she confirmed. "And Minjun? Thank you for being honest. I know that wasn't easy. Thank you for listening." He watched her walk away into the Seoul night, her figure disappearing into the crowd. Then he texted Dae-young for a pickup, his mind already turning over everything they'd discussed. Change. He'd never seriously considered it before. The organization was everything: his identity, his purpose, his family legacy. But standing there on that street corner, Minjun found himself wondering for the first time what life might look like if he chose differently. What kind of man he might become if he wasn't the boss, wasn't the threat, wasn't the legend whispered about in dark rooms. He didn't have answers yet. But for the first time in his adult life, he was beginning to think that maybe, possibly, he could find them. The following weeks were harder than Minjun anticipated. Naomi took their arrangement seriously, pushing him to examine aspects of himself he'd long ago buried. She assigned him homework, journaling about his feelings, noticing when he defaulted to control, practicing being present in everyday moments instead of constantly strategizing. She recommended books on intimacy and connection, podcasts about vulnerability, articles about unlearning toxic patterns. Minjun, who hadn't taken direction from anyone in over a decade, found himself following her instructions with a diligence that surprised him. He wrote in his journal late at night after his organization work was finished. He listened to podcasts during his commutes. He caught himself multiple times a day, slipping into his boss persona and consciously tried to pull back. It was exhausting. It was uncomfortable. It forced him to confront parts of himself he'd been avoiding for years. But he kept doing it, driven by something he couldn't quite name but that felt like it might be hope. Their meetings evolved. Naomi became more relaxed around him as she saw him genuinely trying. She shared more about herself, her love of jazz, her struggles with learning Korean, her complicated relationship with her mother who still lived in Detroit and called too often. She showed him her favorite spots in Seoul, places the tourists didn't know about, hole-in-the-wall restaurants and quiet temples and street markets where he could almost forget who he was. One evening, 2 months into their arrangement, they were walking through Bukshan Hanok village when it started raining. They ducked into a covered walkway, watching the summer storm roll through. "Can I tell you something?" Naomi asked, her voice soft. "Always. I like who you're becoming. Or maybe who you're uncovering. The difference between the man I met at that bar and the man standing here is significant." Minjun felt warmth spread through his chest. "I have a good teacher. You're doing the work. I'm just providing structure." She turned to look at him, rain misting around them. "But I need to know something. Are you doing this for you or for me?" The question landed heavily. Minjun had asked himself the same thing multiple times, but hadn't wanted to examine the answer too closely. Now, with Naomi looking at him directly, he couldn't avoid it. "Both," he admitted. "I started because of you. Because I wanted a chance at something with you. But it's become more than that. I'm doing it now because I don't like who I was. Because I was lonely and isolated and the life I built was killing something important in me." "And the organization?" "Your work. I'm starting to make changes. Small ones. Delegating more. Stepping back from the violent aspects. Looking into legitimate business ventures." He paused. "It's not fast. It can't be. But I'm beginning to see a path out, and that's more than I had before." Naomi nodded, seeming satisfied with his answer. The rain began to lighten, but neither of them moved to leave the shelter of the walkway. "I need to tell you something too," she said. "I didn't expect this. Any of this. I thought we'd meet a few times and you'd lose interest or I'd get frustrated with your lack of progress. But you've surprised me. You've shown up consistently, done the work, been honest even when it was hard. And she stopped, seeming to struggle with her next words. "I care about you. More than I planned to. More than is probably smart given who you still are and what you still do." Minjun's heart rate picked up. "What does that mean?" "It means we need to be careful. Both of us. Because this is starting to feel like more than just two people who talk sometimes, and if we're not careful, someone's going to get hurt." "Would that be so bad? Letting it be more?" "It could be. I still don't date criminals, Minjun. And you're still, technically, a criminal. Until that changes substantively, we're in this weird liminal space where I care about you, but can't fully be with you. And if it does change? If I actually manage to get out? Then we'll see. But that has to be your choice, not something you do because you think it'll get you what you want from me. What if I want it for both reasons?" Naomi smiled slightly. "Then I guess you'd better be very sure you're willing to follow through. Because I won't wait forever. And I won't compromise my principles, even for someone I care about." The rain stopped completely. They walked back through the village in comfortable silence, something unspoken but significant hanging between them. When they reached the main road where they'd part ways, Naomi reached up and touched his face gently, the second time she'd initiated physical contact. "Keep doing the work," she said softly. "Not for me. For you. Become the person you actually want to be." "I am," he promised. "Good." Then maybe we'll get somewhere worth getting to. She left, and Minjun stood watching her go, feeling the ghost of her touch on his face and the weight of possibility in his chest. He had a long way to go. The organization wouldn't release him easily. His reputation preceded him everywhere. The patterns he'd built over decades wouldn't dissolve overnight. But for the first time since he was a teenager, Minjun could imagine a different life. One where he wasn't defined by violence and control and isolation. One where intimacy meant connection instead of performance. One where someone like Naomi might choose to stay, not despite who he was but because of it. He pulled out his phone and texted Dae-young, set up a meeting with the financial people. I want to explore legitimate investments. And find me a good lawyer. It's time to start planning an exit. The response came quickly. Sir, are you sure? Minjun looked at the direction Naomi had walked, then typed, yes. More sure than I've been about anything in a long time. He sent the message and started walking, feeling like he'd just stepped off a cliff, but trusting that maybe, possibly, he'd learned to fly on the way down. The process of extracting himself from the organization proved more complicated than Minjun anticipated. He'd spent 17 years building networks, establishing territories, creating dependencies. Unraveling all of that without triggering violence or internal power struggles required careful strategy and patience he wasn't sure he possessed. But he tried. He spent mornings with lawyers and accountants, mapping out legitimate business ventures. He spent afternoons with his inner circle, slowly delegating authority and testing who might be capable of taking over when the time came. He spent evenings with Naomi when their schedules aligned, and alone when they didn't, working through the psychological aspects of untangling his identity from his role. 3 months into this process, things came to a head. Minjun was in a meeting with representatives from a rival organization when his phone buzzed insistently. Dae-young. He ignored it. The phone buzzed again. And again. Something was wrong. He excused himself and stepped outside, calling back immediately. What is it? Boss, we have a situation. Someone's been asking questions about your personal life. Specifically about the woman you've been seeing. Minjun's blood went cold. Naomi? Yes. They know where she works, where she lives, her schedule. Whoever it is has been thorough. Who? We don't know yet. But sir, if someone's targeting her to get to you. Minjun was already moving, heading for his car. Get security to her apartment immediately. I don't care if she sees them. I want her protected. And find out who's behind this. Today, he drove faster than was wise, his mind racing through possibilities. It could be internal, someone unhappy with his plans to step back, thinking Naomi was a weakness to exploit. It could be external, a rival organization seeing an opportunity. Either way, he'd brought this danger to her door by being careless, by allowing their connection to become visible. His security team was already in place when he arrived at Naomi's building. She stood in her doorway, arms crossed, face stormy. What the hell is this? She demanded as he approached. I came home to find armed men in my hallway telling me I can't leave without protection. You promised, Minjun. You promised you wouldn't do this. Someone's been investigating you. Someone dangerous. I had to. You had to what? Decide for me how to handle my safety? Violate our agreement without even calling to explain. Her voice rose. This is exactly what I was afraid of. This right here. You defaulting to control instead of communication. Naomi, please. I know how this looks, but there's a genuine threat. Of course there's a threat. There's always a threat when you're involved with someone like you. That's the whole point. That's why I said I don't date criminals. She stepped back into her apartment. I need you to leave. I can't leave you unprotected. Then post your people in the building lobby or outside or wherever. But get them out of my hallway and get yourself out of my doorway. I need space to think. Minjun wanted to argue, wanted to make her understand the severity of the situation. But he could see in her eyes that pushing would only make things worse. He nodded slowly. The security stays. But they'll be less visible. And I'll give you space. He paused. I'm sorry. You're right. I should have called first, explained, given you a choice in how to handle this. Yes, you should have. Her expression softened slightly. I know you were scared. I know you were trying to protect me. But you can't default to your old patterns the second things get complicated. That's not growth. That's just control with better packaging. The accuracy of her assessment stung. Minjun nodded again, turned, and left, instructing his security team to be discreet as he passed them. In his car, he called Dae-young. What do we know? It's internal. Min-hyuk's faction. They're not happy about your exit plans, and they've decided your relationship with the American woman is leverage they can use to keep you in place. Min-hyuk. One of his father's old associates, someone Minjun had never fully trusted, but had kept close out of obligation to family legacy. He should have seen this coming. What do they want? A meeting. Tomorrow. They want assurances that your exit won't destabilize the organization or leave them vulnerable. Set it up. And make it clear that if anything happens to Naomi, the agreement I've been trying to maintain ends immediately. Understood. Minjun drove aimlessly for an hour, trying to settle his thoughts. He'd promised Naomi space, so going back to her apartment was out of the question. But the need to make sure she was safe, to fix this situation he'd created, gnawed at him. Finally, he sent her a text. I know you need space. I'm giving it to you. But please know that I'm handling the source of the threat. This will be resolved soon. And I'm sorry. You deserved better from me. Her response came 20 minutes later. Thank you for the apology. And for the space. I need a few days to think about whether I can do this. The threat isn't your fault. But how you handled it is a pattern we've talked about. I need to decide if I believe you can actually change. The uncertainty in her message terrified him more than any physical threat ever had. He'd been so focused on the external work, the exit strategy, the legitimate businesses, the surface-level changes, that he'd failed to internalize the deeper shift Naomi had been trying to teach him. When faced with crisis, he'd immediately reverted to his default mode: control without consultation, protection without permission, decision-making without collaboration. That night, Minjun wrote pages in his journal, cataloging every moment where he'd defaulted to old patterns, every time he'd prioritized control over connection. The list was longer than he wanted to acknowledge. He'd made progress, yes, but clearly not enough. Not where it mattered most. The meeting with Min-hyuk's faction the next day was tense. They sat in a private room in one of the organization's legitimate front businesses, 6 men who'd been part of this world longer than Minjun had been alive. They made their position clear: his exit couldn't happen without certain guarantees. They wanted continued access to his networks, his connections, his protection against rival organizations even after he was no longer actively involved. And the woman? Minjun asked flatly. Your investigation into her stops now. Or we have a different kind of problem. Min-hyuk leaned back, studying him. She's made you soft. The old Minjun wouldn't have cared about one foreign teacher. The old Minjun was isolated and miserable. If that's strength in your view, you can keep it. Minjun met his gaze steadily. I'm willing to negotiate a transition that protects everyone's interests. But my personal life is off limits. Make peace with that or prepare for the consequences. The negotiations took hours. By the end, Minjun had agreed to a 2-year transition period where he'd remain nominally involved while gradually transferring power to a council of trusted associates. In exchange, his personal life, including Naomi, would be completely hands-off. Any violation of that agreement would void the entire arrangement. It wasn't a perfect solution. 2 years was longer than he'd hoped. But it was workable, and it removed the immediate threat. When he left the meeting, he called Naomi. She didn't answer. He sent a text explaining that the threat had been addressed, that she was no longer being investigated or targeted, that his security team would pull back to a standard perimeter that wouldn't interfere with her daily life. She responded hours later. Thank you for handling it. I still need more time. Minjun gave her a week before reaching out again. He sent a simple message: I know I failed you. I want to do better. If you're willing to talk, I'm willing to listen to whatever you need to say. Her response came the next morning: coffee tomorrow. 3 p.m. Same place as always. He arrived 15 minutes early and waited, his anxiety higher than it had been for any business negotiation. When Naomi walked in, she looked tired, like she hadn't been sleeping well. She ordered her usual Americano and sat across from him, her expression guarded. "I've been thinking a lot this past week," she said without preamble. "About what I want and what I can handle and whether this," she gestured between them, "is something I'm equipped for." Minjun waited, afraid to speak. "You've made genuine progress," she continued. "I can see the work you've been doing. But what happened last week showed me that progress isn't linear. When you're stressed or scared, you default to old patterns. That's normal, actually. That's how change works. But it's also a warning that you're not as far along as either of us might have hoped." "I know," he said quietly. "I saw it too. The second I felt threatened, I became the boss instead of staying the person I've been trying to become." "Right. And here's the thing, I can't be the person who helps you figure this out while also being the person you're trying to build a relationship with. Those are two different roles, and they conflict. If I'm your teacher, I can't be your partner. And if I'm your partner, I can't be responsible for your growth." Minjun felt his chest tighten. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying we need to decide what this is. If you want to keep working on yourself, I can keep helping with that. But we stay in the friend zone, and you work with an actual therapist on the deeper stuff. Or," she paused, "we acknowledge that there's something here worth exploring, and we try to move forward as equals, which means you have to trust me enough to include me in decisions that affect me. No more protecting me without asking. No more defaulting to control when things get hard." "I want the second option," Minjun said immediately. "I want to explore what this could be. As equals." "Are you sure? Because if you're not ready, if you backslide into old patterns, it will hurt worse than just walking away now." "I'm sure. And I know I'll make mistakes. But I want to make them while trying to be with you, not while keeping you at a safe distance." Naomi was quiet for a long moment, studying him with those dark, intelligent eyes that had first caught his attention months ago. "Okay," she finally said. "But we go slow. And we have explicit conversations about boundaries, expectations, all of it. I'm not guessing what you need or want. You have to tell me. I can do that. And you have to get a therapist. A real one. Because I'm serious about not being responsible for your healing. Already on it. I have an appointment next week with someone who specializes in trauma and intimacy issues." "Good." She reached across the table and took his hand, the third time she'd initiated physical touch. "I care about you, Minjun. More than is probably wise. But I need to know you're serious about this. About changing, about getting out, about learning to be in a relationship that isn't based on control or performance." "I am serious. More serious than I've been about anything except maybe staying alive." He squeezed her hand gently. "I want to be someone worthy of you. Not perfect. Just better. Always working to be better." "Then let's try," she said. "But Minjun, the first time you shut me out or make decisions for me without consultation, I'm out. I mean it. I won't sign up for a relationship where my agency doesn't matter." "Understood. And if I start slipping, I need you to call me on it. Immediately. Don't let me get away with it just because you care about me. Deal." They finished their coffee and walked out into the Seoul afternoon, still holding hands. It felt significant, this small public declaration that they were trying something new. Minjun knew people in the organization would notice. Knew there would be talk. But for the first time, he found he didn't care what they thought. Over the following weeks, they settled into a new rhythm. They still met regularly, but now their conversations weren't framed as lessons. They were simply two people getting to know each other, learning each other's rhythms and quirks and wounds. Minjun told Naomi about his childhood, about his father's expectations and his mother's early death. Naomi shared more about her complicated family history, about her younger brother who'd followed their father's path and was now in prison. They went on actual dates, movies and dinners, and a jazz concert Naomi had been wanting to attend. Minjun learned to be present without agenda, to enjoy moments without constantly strategizing what came next. It was harder than he expected, but also more rewarding. One evening, about 5 weeks into their relationship, they were in Naomi's apartment, the first time Minjun had been invited inside. They'd had dinner at a nearby restaurant and come back to watch a movie, something light and funny that Naomi loved and Minjun had never seen. Halfway through, Naomi paused the movie and turned to face him. "Can we talk about something?" "Of course." I want to talk about physical intimacy. Minjun felt his entire body tense. Okay. We've been together for over a month, and we haven't done more than hold hands and one brief kiss goodnight last week. I'm not complaining. I appreciate that you're not pushing. But I want to know what you're thinking. What you're afraid of. He took a breath, trying to articulate the swirl of anxiety that came up every time he thought about taking things further. I'm afraid of hurting you. Of overwhelming you. Of becoming that person who drives you away because I can't figure out how to be different in this area. That's a lot of fear, Naomi said gently. And it's based on past experiences that don't have to repeat themselves. You don't understand what you're signing up for. Then help me understand. Talk to me instead of just sitting with the fear. Minjun shifted, uncomfortable. I'm physically large. I have significant stamina. I've spent years learning to use both as tools for dominance. And every time I've tried to be intimate with someone, it ends badly. Either they're hurt or scared or disappointed, and I'm left feeling like some kind of monster. Do you want to be intimate with me? Yes. God, yes. But I wanted to be different. I want to figure out how to connect instead of perform. And I don't know how to do that. Naomi moved closer, her body warm against his side. Here's what I think. I think you've been approaching sex the same way you approach everything else, as something to control and master. But what if you didn't? What if you approached it as something to experience and discover with a partner? I don't know what that means practically. It means you stop trying to prove anything. Stop worrying about your stamina or your size or whether I can handle you. Just be present. Pay attention. Communicate. Let it be collaborative instead of a solo performance you're delivering to an audience. That sounds simple when you say it. It's not simple. It requires vulnerability and trust and a willingness to let go of control. But Minjun, she touched his face, making him look at her. I think you can do it. I think you're capable of the kind of intimacy you want. You just have to be willing to try something completely different from everything you've learned. And if I fail, then we talk about it. We figure out what went wrong and try again differently. That's how relationships work. You don't get it perfect on the first try. You learn together. The simplicity of that concept, that failure wasn't final, that mistakes could be opportunities for growth, felt revolutionary. Minjun had spent so long treating every intimate encounter as a pass/fail test that the idea of approaching it as a collaborative learning experience hadn't occurred to him. I want to try, he said quietly. But slowly. With lots of communication. That's exactly what I want too. Naomi smiled. How about we start with something easy? Just being physically close without any expectation that it leads anywhere. Can you do that? I think so. They settled back into the couch, Naomi tucked against Minjun's side, his arm around her shoulders. They finished the movie like that, just being close, and Minjun worked on staying present instead of spiraling into anxiety about what might come next. It was harder than it should have been. His mind kept jumping ahead, cataloging all the ways this could go wrong. But every time he noticed himself future tripping, he brought his attention back to the moment. The warmth of Naomi's body. The sound of her laughter at the funny parts. The comfortable weight of her leaning against him. When the movie ended, Naomi turned in his arms to face him. How was that? Good. Harder than I expected, but good. What made it hard? My brain kept trying to turn it into something else. Kept worrying about what comes next instead of just enjoying what was happening. That makes sense. You're used to always being 3 steps ahead. But intimacy requires being right here, right now. She reached up and kissed him softly. We'll work on it. Together. Minjun kissed her back, letting himself be fully present in the moment. No agenda, no strategy, no performance. Just this, her lips against his, her hand on his face, the taste of her like possibility and trust. When they pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Naomi smiled. See? You can do this. With you, he corrected. I can do this with you. Then that's a start. They spent another hour talking about boundaries and expectations, having the explicit conversations Naomi had insisted on. She told him what felt good and what she needed to feel safe. He shared his fears and his hopes and his commitment to approaching this differently. By the time he left her apartment that night, Minjun felt cautiously optimistic for the first time about the intimate aspects of their relationship. The next several weeks became a study in patience and presence. They moved slowly, adding physical intimacy in incremental steps. Longer kisses. Hands exploring over clothes. Eventually, clothes coming off. Each step required conversations beforehand and processing afterwards. Minjun learned to check in constantly, to read Naomi's responses, to adjust in real time based on what she communicated. It was nothing like any intimate experience he'd had before. There was no performance, no dominance, no need to prove anything. Just two people learning each other's bodies and responses, building trust in small moments, creating something entirely new. The first time they were fully intimate, Minjun was terrified. They'd planned it, talked about timing and expectations, and what would happen if anyone needed to stop. Naomi had been patient but firm, insisting they could only proceed if Minjun could commit to being present instead of performing. Lying in her bed, with her beneath him and years of toxic patterns trying to resurface, Minjun had to consciously fight every instinct. His body wanted to take over, to fall back on muscle memory and dominance. But Naomi's hands on his face, her voice soft and steady, brought him back. "Stay with me," she said. "Right here. Don't go wherever you're going in your head. I'm trying. I know. You're doing so well." She kissed him. Slower. Gentler. "We have all night. There's no race to finish." He listened. Adjusted. Let her guide him into a rhythm that worked for both of them. And when his stamina started to become an issue, when he realized he could keep going long after most men would have finished, Naomi simply said, "It's okay to stop. You don't have to prove anything. I'm satisfied." That permission to stop, to not perform, to accept satisfaction as something mutual rather than solo, broke something open in him. He pulled back, his breathing ragged, and just held her. They lay tangled together, both spent in different ways, and Minjun realized he'd never felt closer to another person in his life. "How was that?" Naomi asked after a while, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest. "Different. Good different. Scary different. You did really well. You stayed present. You listened. You adjusted when I needed you to." She kissed his shoulder. "I'm proud of you." The praise shouldn't have mattered so much, but it did. Minjun held her tighter, feeling something in his chest that might have been happiness or relief, or just the simple pleasure of being accepted completely. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For staying. For being patient. For teaching me what this could be. You did the work, Minjun. I just provided a safe space for you to try." She shifted to look at him. "But I need you to know something. This isn't fixed. You'll have moments where you slip back into old patterns. When that happens, we'll talk about it and adjust. This is ongoing, not a destination we've reached." "I understand." "Good." She settled back against him. "Now stay here with me. Just like this. No thinking about what comes next or what you should be doing. Just be here." Minjun did as she asked, letting himself simply exist in the moment. Outside, Seoul hummed with its endless energy. Inside, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Minjun felt at peace. The 2-year transition period Minjun had negotiated felt both impossibly long and frighteningly short. Long when he wanted to be free of the organization completely, to build a life with Naomi without the shadow of his past looming over them. Short when he considered everything that needed to happen for his exit to be successful and permanent. He worked methodically. The legitimate businesses he'd invested in started showing real returns. He moved money gradually into clean accounts, building a financial foundation that wouldn't collapse the moment he stepped away. He identified and groomed successors within the organization, men who could maintain the structure without him. And he continued therapy, working through decades of learned behavior and trauma. Naomi remained patient but clear about her boundaries. She wouldn't move in with him while he was still active in the organization. She wouldn't meet his family or associates from that world. She kept her life separate and protected, and Minjun respected that even when it frustrated him. She was drawing a line in the sand, showing him exactly what waited on the other side of his transformation. 6 months into their relationship, Minjun had his first major backslide. A territorial dispute had escalated to violence, and several of his people were hurt. The old Minjun would have responded with overwhelming force, establishing dominance through fear. But he'd been working on different approaches, trying to build structures that didn't rely on violence. When the attacks continued, something in him snapped. He authorized a response that was brutal and decisive, solving the immediate problem but contradicting everything he'd been working toward. The guilty party was dealt with in ways that left no room for further challenge. Naomi found out through news reports of gangland violence in Gangnam. She called him immediately. "Was that you?" Minjun closed his eyes, sitting in his office surrounded by reports and damaged infrastructure. "Yes, I see." Her voice was carefully neutral. "We need to talk. Tonight." They met at her apartment. She let him in but didn't touch him, didn't offer the warmth she usually greeted him with. They sat on opposite ends of her couch, the distance between them feeling vast. "Tell me what happened," she said. Minjun explained the situation, the attacks, the threat to his people, the decision he'd made. He didn't try to justify it or minimize it. Just laid it out clearly. "So when things got hard, you defaulted to violence," Naomi said when he finished. "Yes, that's who you still are. Under all the work and therapy and growth, when pushed, you're still the mafia boss who solves problems with force." "I know." Minjun felt the weight of that truth settle over him. "And I don't know if I can be anything else while I'm still in this world. The structures demand certain responses. The people I'm dealing with only understand certain languages. I can't exit completely yet, and while I'm in, I can't always choose the better path." "Then we have a problem," Naomi said quietly. "Because I can't be with someone who resorts to violence. I've lived that life. I know where it leads. And I won't do it again, not even for you." "I understand." They sat in silence. Minjun could feel everything he'd built with her slipping away, and the loss felt more devastating than any business failure or territorial defeat ever had. "What do you want to do?" he asked finally. "I don't know," Naomi admitted, and he heard the pain in her voice. "I love you. That's new information for both of us, but it's true. I love who you're becoming and who you want to be. But I can't love the parts of you that are still willing to hurt people to maintain power. Those things can't coexist in my life." The admission that she loved him should have been a moment of joy. Instead, it felt like goodbye. "I love you too," Minjun said, the words surprising him with their certainty. "Which is why I'm going to make you a promise. That was the last time. No matter what happens, no matter how hard things get, I won't authorize violence again. I'll find other solutions or I'll accelerate my exit, but I won't be that person anymore. Can you keep that promise?" "I have to. Because losing you is worse than any threat the organization can make." Naomi moved closer, taking his hand. "You understand what you're saying? If someone comes at you and your only defense is force, you're choosing to be vulnerable instead." "Yes. That's not tactical. That's not smart from a survival standpoint." "I know. But I'd rather be vulnerable and have a chance with you than be invulnerable and alone." She studied his face for a long moment, then pulled him into a hug. Minjun held her tightly, feeling her heartbeat against his chest. "Okay," she said into his shoulder. "One more chance. But Minjun, if it happens again, I'm done. I'll walk away and you won't be able to find me. I mean that. I know you do. And it won't happen again." He meant it. Whatever it cost him, whatever vulnerabilities it created, he would find another way. Because Naomi had become the center of everything he was building toward, and losing her wasn't an option he could accept. The promise proved harder to keep than Minjun anticipated. Violence was the currency of his world, the tool everyone understood and respected. Choosing not to use it meant accepting losses, enduring challenges, appearing weak to people who would exploit that perception. His organization chafed at his new restrictions. Rivals tested his boundaries. Internally, questions about his fitness to lead grew louder. But Minjun held firm. He negotiated where he once would have threatened. He absorbed losses that could have been prevented with force. He delegated more authority to his successors, accelerating the transition timeline even when his advisors cautioned against moving too fast. 8 months after his promise to Naomi, Minjun stood in a meeting with the organization's leadership council and announced his complete departure, effective in 6 months. Earlier than planned, More abrupt than anyone expected, but necessary. He'd lined up his successor, Dae-young, who'd been with him since the beginning and who Minjun trusted to maintain the organization without the brutality. The announcement created chaos. Some celebrated, seeing opportunity in the power vacuum. Others protested, insisting the organization needed his leadership. A few plotted, seeing his exit as weakness to exploit. But Minjun navigated it all without reverting to his old patterns. He used diplomacy, financial incentives, strategic alliances. It was messier and slower than violence would have been, but it worked. Naomi watched from the sidelines, offering support but not interference. She'd maintained her boundaries, refusing to be drawn into his world even as she cheered his progress out of it. Her apartment remained a sanctuary, a space where Minjun could be just himself, not the boss or the legend or the man everyone wanted something from. They continued building their relationship, learning each other's rhythms and deepening their connection. Physical intimacy remained something they approached thoughtfully. Minjun still had moments where old patterns tried to reassert themselves, where his body wanted to perform instead of connect. But Naomi's patient guidance and his own commitment to being different kept him grounded. One night, about 10 months into their relationship, they were in her bed after making love slow and connected, the way they'd learned together. Minjun held her close, feeling the satisfaction of mutual fulfillment in ways he never had before. "I used to think satisfaction was about endurance," he said quietly. "About how long I could last, how much I could give. But it's not that at all, is it?" "No," Naomi agreed, her fingers tracing idle patterns on his skin. "It's about presence. About being with someone instead of performing for them. About mutual pleasure instead of solo achievement. You taught me that. You learned it. I just created space for the learning." Minjun kissed the top of her head. "I would have destroyed this. Before you, I would have turned this into another failed connection because I wouldn't have known how to be different. Maybe. Or maybe you would have figured it out eventually. I'd like to think you would have." "I wouldn't have," he said with certainty. "I needed you. Needed someone who could see through the legend to the person underneath and care about that person enough to demand better." Naomi shifted to look at him. "You know what I love about you?" "What?" "That you're capable of this. Of vulnerability and honesty and growth. A lot of men aren't. They get trapped in their patterns and never escape. But you did. You chose something different, even when it was hard. Because you made it worth choosing. No. Because you decided you were worth more than what you'd settled for." She kissed him softly. "Never forget that. This change came from you, not from me. I was just the catalyst." They fell asleep tangled together, and Minjun dreamed of a future he'd never allowed himself to imagine before, one where he wasn't defined by violence or a reputation, where intimacy meant connection instead of conquest, where he could simply be a man who loved a woman who loved him back. The final 6 months of Minjun's transition were turbulent. Rivals made plays for territory. Some of his people defected, unwilling to follow Dae-young's leadership. Financial complications arose as Minjun worked to fully separate his legitimate businesses from the organization's infrastructure. There were moments when violence seemed inevitable, when Minjun's promise to Naomi appeared impossible to maintain. But he held firm. When a rival organization made a direct challenge, Minjun negotiated a territorial agreement that satisfied both parties without bloodshed. When internal factions threatened mutiny, he used financial incentives and strategic alliances to maintain cohesion. When external law enforcement started investigating his transition, he cooperated through his lawyers, accepting legal consequences for past actions in exchange for a clean exit. It cost him. He lost money, territory, reputation. Some of his former allies turned against him, calling him weak. The man he'd been, the fearsome mafia boss whose name alone commanded respect, began to fade, replaced by something quieter but more substantial. Naomi stood by him through all of it. She didn't make it easy, continued maintaining her boundaries, continued calling him on his patterns when they emerged. But she was there. Present. Supportive. A constant reminder of what he was working toward. On his final day of official involvement with the organization, Minjun met with the Leadership Council one last time. He transferred his remaining authority to Dae-young, signed the documents that formalized his exit, and walked out of the office he'd occupied for over 15 years. His security detail, reduced to 2 men, waited outside. "Where to, boss?" one asked. "Not boss anymore," Minjun corrected. "Just Minjun. And I'm good from here. You two are released from duty." They looked uncomfortable with the dismissal, but ultimately nodded and left. Minjun stood alone on the Seoul street for the first time in decades, without security, without authority, without the weight of the organization on his shoulders. He felt lighter than he had in years. He called Naomi. "I'm out. How do you feel?" "Free. Terrified. But mostly free. Come over. Let's celebrate." When he arrived at her apartment, she opened the door with a smile that made everything he'd lost worth it. They ordered takeout and ate on her couch, watching a movie neither of them paid much attention to. Later, in her bed, Minjun held her close and felt something settle in his chest, peace, or something close to it. "What happens now?" Naomi asked. "Now I figure out who Minjun is without the organization. I build the legitimate businesses. I work on being better every day. I love you without reservation or complication." "That sounds nice." "It does, doesn't it?" He kissed her temple. "Thank you." "For what?" "For staying. For being patient. For seeing something in me worth salvaging." "You're not a salvage project, Minjun. You're a person who decided to grow." "That's not the same thing." "Still. Thank you." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other and the possibility of a future neither had been certain they'd reach. 3 years after their first meeting in the Itaewon Lounge, Minjun and Naomi sat in the same coffee shop where they'd had their first real conversation. Minjun's legitimate businesses had flourished. The organization had continued under Dae-jung's leadership, leaving Minjun alone as agreed. His past occasionally surfaced, former associates requesting meetings, rivals testing whether he'd truly gone soft, but Minjun navigated it without reverting to old patterns. More importantly, he'd continued the internal work. Therapy had become a permanent part of his life, something he approached with the same dedication he'd once given to maintaining territory. His relationship with Naomi had deepened into something solid and sustainable, built on communication and mutual respect rather than performance or power. "I've been thinking about something," Naomi said, stirring her Americano. "What's that?" "I want you to meet my mom." Minjun felt his eyebrows rise. In 3 years, Naomi had kept her family separate from their relationship, a boundary he'd respected without question. "Are you sure?" "I think so. I've told her about you. About what you were and what you've become." She's cautious, obviously. But she wants to meet the man I'm serious about. "You're serious about me?" Naomi laughed. "Minjun, I've been serious about you since about month 6. I thought that was obvious. I hoped, but I didn't want to assume." "Well, now you know. And if you want to keep being serious about this, meeting my family is the next step." "I want that," Minjun said immediately. "When?" "She's coming to visit next month. We'll have dinner. Just the 3 of us." "Okay." He took her hand across the table. "Naomi, I need to tell you something." "Go ahead." 3 years ago, I was drowning and didn't know it. I'd built everything I thought I wanted and none of it satisfied me. I was isolated and lonely and convinced that was just who I was destined to be. And then I met you and you didn't let me hide. You saw through every defense I had and demanded better. Not just for yourself, but for me. Minjun. Let me finish. You changed my life. Not by fixing me or saving me, but by showing me what was possible if I was willing to do the work. And I want to spend the rest of my life continuing that work, being worthy of you, building something real and lasting. So he pulled a small box from his pocket and opened it, revealing a simple diamond ring. "Will you marry me?" Naomi stared at the ring, then at him, her eyes filling with tears. "You're serious?" "Completely. I know we'll have to figure out the logistics, your work, where we'll live, how we'll handle cultural differences. I know it won't always be easy. But I love you and I want to build a life with you. A real one, where we're equals and partners and we face everything together." "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you." Minjun slipped the ring on her finger with shaking hands. She leaned across the table and kissed him, both of them crying and laughing and drawing looks from other patrons who quickly looked away, giving them privacy. "I love you," Naomi said when they finally pulled apart. "I love who you are and who you're becoming. I love that you did the work and kept doing it even when it was hard. I love that you chose this, chose me, chose growth, chose vulnerability over power. You made it worth choosing. We made it worth choosing," she corrected. Together. They sat in that coffee shop for hours, planning a future that felt both thrilling and achievable. Minjun had lost almost everything that had defined him for decades: power, reputation, fear, dominance. But sitting across from Naomi, her hand in his and her ring on her finger, he realized he'd gained something infinitely more valuable: connection, intimacy. Love that wasn't based on performance or legend, but on genuine understanding and mutual respect. He thought about the man he'd been 3 years ago, the Mafia boss whose reputation preceded him, whose physical presence overwhelmed everyone, who confused dominance with satisfaction and control with connection. That man had been powerful and feared and utterly alone. That man had driven away everyone who got close because he didn't know any other way to be. But that man was gone now, replaced by someone quieter but stronger. Someone who understood that true power came from vulnerability, that real satisfaction required presence, and that the deepest connections happened when you stopped performing and started being. Naomi had been right about everything. She'd seen through him from that first night, identified his patterns, named his fears. But more than that, she'd believed he could change and given him space to do it. She'd stayed when others had fled, not because she was overwhelmed by his legend, but because she saw past it to the person underneath. She'd set boundaries and enforced them, teaching him that respect meant honoring someone's autonomy even when it was inconvenient. "What are you thinking?" Naomi asked, watching him with those intelligent eyes that never missed anything. "That I'm grateful," Minjun said. "That every woman before you was right to leave, because they knew they couldn't be what I needed. They knew I wasn't capable of real intimacy, not then. But you stayed because you saw potential, and you helped me become someone who could actually love and be loved. You were always capable," Naomi said gently. "You just didn't know it yet. You learned all the wrong lessons about what strength and power and satisfaction meant. But underneath all that, the capacity for connection was there. You just needed someone to help you find it." Minjun stood and pulled her up with him, wrapping her in his arms right there in the middle of the coffee shop. She came willingly, fitting against him perfectly, and he held her like she was the most precious thing in his life. Which she was. "I love you," he said into her hair. "Thank you for staying." "I love you too," she replied. "Thank you for being worth the wait." They left the coffee shop hand in hand, stepping out into Seoul's bustling streets. Minjun felt the city's energy flowing around them, millions of people living their lives, pursuing their dreams, building their futures. He was just one man among many now, no longer the feared boss whose name commanded respect. He was simply Minjun, engaged to be married to an incredible woman, building a legitimate life, learning every day how to be better. The legend of the Mafia boss whose presence overwhelmed everyone had faded. In its place was something quieter, but infinitely more fulfilling, a man who learned that true satisfaction came not from endurance or dominance, but from connection and presence and the courage to be vulnerable. Every woman before Naomi had screamed and fled, and they'd been right to do so. Minjun hadn't been ready for them, hadn't been capable of giving them what they needed. But Naomi had stayed, not because she was different, but because she'd arrived at the right moment and been willing to wait while he did the hardest work of his life, transforming himself from a legend into a person. And now, walking through Seoul with her hand in his and their future stretching out before them, Minjun understood what he'd been missing all along. Satisfaction wasn't about performance. It wasn't about overwhelming anyone with stamina or size or intensity. It was about being present with someone who saw you completely and chose you anyway. It was about building something together, slowly and deliberately, with honesty and patience and love. The Mafia boss was gone. In his place was a man who knew how to be intimate, who understood that vulnerability required more courage than dominance, who had learned that the deepest satisfaction came from connection rather than conquest. And for the first time in his life, Minjun was truly, completely satisfied.